everybody. Welcome to another edition of From the Other Sideline with your host, Melissa Triebwasser, brought to you by Frogs. Today, I am joined by a very special guest, one of the foremost authorities on football in the state of Texas, senior writer, Dave Campbell's Texas Football, Mike Craven. Mike is a familiar face to a lot of Frogs Today followers. He's jumped on the show with us a couple times, but it's great to have you join us today, Mike.
Appreciate you having me on. Yeah, I don't know if I live up to those kind words, but I will try.
Well, I'm always a big fan of trying to butter people up before, I ask them to do things for me. And so, it works out pretty well. Mike, I wanted to talk to you to kind of review the TCU football season and just what this season means for the Horned Frogs, big picture for the university and for college football in Texas. And as somebody who found themselves probably at far more TCU games than they initially expected at the beginning of the season, I figured you were a great person to reach out. So tell me just a little bit about when you, as a writer for kind of the foremost authority of football in the state of Texas, started to realize that you were going to spend a lot of time watching TCU play.
Oklahoma State. I think when Texas beat Oklahoma, you kind of knew that win over the Sooners, wasn't like, what it would be normal seasons, right? That Oklahoma wasn't what they always are. I didn't believe in Kansas. I didn't know how sustainable that was. But I was in the house when they came back, against Oklahoma State and then won in overtime and the fans rushing on the field and then being in the locker room afterwards, and nobody seemed as surprised as we did in the media, right? Like the coaches, the players, they all seemed pretty composed, pretty confident in themselves. And that's something Sonny Dykes talked about multiple times, was the maturity of this team. When they were ahead, they didn't get too high. When they were behind, they didn't get too low. And you started going, okay, well, the talent's always been there. Maybe they have turned the mentality corner and it ended up that they did. So probably that Oklahoma State comeback was the first time I was like, oh, they can go compete for the Big 12 championship. I think nationally, like in terms of college football playoff, it was the game against Texas in Austin, DKR. It wasn't an offensive battle, 48-45. They had to go win that game in a gritty, tough, physical way, and they were able to do that. Doing that in Austin against a UT team that was pretty good this year, I think was like, okay, they can go and beat Baylor. All of a sudden, they're in this thing.
You talk about that Texas game, and I think that was kind of the game where a lot of people nationally started to pay attention to TCU in a way they hadn't previously. To be, 7.5-point underdogs heading on the road in front of that environment, Gary Patterson on the other sideline. I mean, obviously all the storylines were there. What most impressed you about, maybe not on the field, but the mental makeup that you mentioned about TCU after that game?
Well, their physicality stood out on the field. You watched those first couple series and the Texas defense was dominating. The TCU defense was dominating. And it was like an old school smash mouth game. And you had seen TCU win kind of the shootouts, and you knew they could score 50 points on people, but could they play that kind of game? Could they win that type of football game? Potentially one that they'd have to play against Michigan or a Georgia or whoever they're going to see in the college football playoff. How did they stack up that way? So that was impressive. And then again, I think it was the same kind of feeling after Oklahoma State of, we got down there afterwards in the locker room and we expected everybody to be on cloud nine and riding high and talking trash. And it was just another day at the office. They beat a team they thought they were supposed to beat, and they didn't see themselves as a 7.5-point underdog. And that goes a long way. Like, you get around this enough and you're like, okay, the talent is pretty equal across the board. Like, TCU is not more talented than Texas. That isn't more talented than Oklahoma, Texas Tech, Baylor right there, right? It comes down to mentality, belief, confidence, and execution. And they were checking those boxes every single time. They never seemed to waver. They never seemed to be bothered by anything. And just their constant ability to answer the bell. After a while, it couldn't be a coincidence. It couldn't be a fluke. You were waiting for the bottom to fall out and for you to go like, oh, okay, well, that's what they were overachieving. That's what we thought was going to happen. They're going to be 10-2 or 9-3 or something like that. But they just kept winning. And eventually it's not an underdog story anymore. Eventually they were doing exactly what they thought they could do.
How unusual is a team coming off of the 3 previous seasons that TCU had where, very few of those players, as we know, had played in a bowl game period. The Frogs have been kind of in that 5-7, 7-5 range. to have the mentality of not being able to control their emotions after a big win like that, after, pulling off upsets and pulling off those big comebacks. I mean, you just don't see that a lot in college football, period, especially for a team that, they hadn't really been there before.
Yeah, when we were at the college football playoff week, I asked Ivan Mazel of On3 now, who's one legendary sports writer, one of the best of my lifetime, right? I asked him kind of, what does this remind you of? Like, can you tell me anything? You've been around this a lot longer than me. The thing he said was 1981 Clemson. So I was born in 85, right? So nothing in my lifetime compares to this. This bucks all conventional wisdom. I'm a stars matter guy. I believe in the blue chip ratio, and this flied in the face of that, right? This was an anomaly in almost every single way. First year head coach, a team that was 16-18 in the 3 years before Sonny Dykes got there. A team that had 4 players who had ever played, past Thanksgiving weekend, basically, at TCU in their college career. Like, all of these things that just don't make any sense. And they did it, and they did it week in and week out. I can't think of anything like it, especially in the state of Texas. 2009 was the last time somebody played for a college football championship in this state. Texas has only done it, twice in my life. No other team has done it. And so it was a cool story, and I think it woke the state up a little bit, right? Like, it feels like it rejuvenated the state in a way, because I think Texas Tech can watch it and go, we can do that. And Baylor can watch it and go, we can do that. And Houston moving to the Big 12 can watch it and go, we can do that. And so I think it's given a lot of hope to people around the country and around the state. And I think that's also an important piece of this season.
Kind of building off of that, 2 questions that come out of that is one, to have all of those precedents set, to have all of those kind of once in a lifetime, once in a generational type of things happen, and to have Sonny Dykes be at the helm of it. I mean, obviously the history of Sonny Dykes and Spike Dykes in Texas and what they've meant in college football in the state and football, period. How surprised were you that Sonny Dykes was able to kind of instigate this type of turnaround at TCU?
I'm biased here. I love Sonny. I have for a long time. Like, my grandfather and his dad coached together at Texas, and so I always saw it as it was a Cal problem, not a Sonny problem. And I think the records have bared that out. If you look at everywhere else Sonny's been, he's won a lot of games. At SMU, they just didn't have the horses, to finish seasons. But they always started really well. They always scored a lot of points. And you thought if he got to a place where he had the talent to have a good defense and to field it too deep and really go at it, he was going to be capable of doing that. I think he's a really excellent coach. And what Sonny does really well is he doesn't micromanage. He lets really he hires smart guys, and then he lets them go do their job, and he does that with Garrett Riley, does that with Joe Gillespie. As a Texas football guy, as a former high school football reporter, Dave Campbell's known for high school. It was really cool to see, a former high school coach that coached at Navarro Junior College coming up, an offensive coordinator that played at Muleshoe, who coached at Lubbock Roosevelt while he was a student at Texas Tech. Obviously, Joe Gillespie at Stephenville for 20 plus years. It felt like one of ours. It felt like one of us. It was a very easy team to get behind for the state of Texas. So it was really cool to see the son of Spike kind of get that recognition. And also, it was cool to see a Mike Leach disciple do it this year, right? That was also really, really awesome. I think it was something he leaned into. He was open about, he was honest about throughout the run. And I think that was really cool too, because I think a lot of people got to see how awesome Sonny is as an interview, how honest he is as a coach. And it's refreshing, because as somebody who talks to coaches pretty much every second of every day of my life, it is not something that it always is true.
We're going to put a pin in kind of the way that he hires and manages his coaches and get back to that at the end, because obviously there's some news out there. But before we do that, you talked about, this waking up the state of Texas when it comes to college football and what teams are capable of. How much of a affront was it to Texas and Texas A&M that TCU was the first team in the state to do this and the new wave of what the college football postseason looks like?
Yeah, I think it's another indictment of the culture in College Station and Austin over the last 10 years. And it's an example of how some of those excuses just don't hold water. Like, a first-year head coach walks into a program and turns it around. Like, you can do it too. You're in the Big 12, you're in the SEC, you're capable of doing that. And so, I think what it does say is that it's not all about talent. Like, sure, the teams who mostly win are the most talented, but they're also the best coached, and they're also the most disciplined, and they execute the most, and they have the biggest support staff. And so, I think TCU's success does fly. It should fly in the face of Texas and Texas A&M, especially at Texas, because they had a chance to hire Sonny. Like he was going to go there, and some of those donors thought that the SMU head coach wasn't, good enough to be the next Texas head coach. And I know that win in Austin was probably pretty special for him because of that reason.
When you look at what TCU was able to accomplish this year, it's really easy to kind of see the perfect storm situation that was brewing. They were not just at the top of potentially their age cycle, but their development cycle too. And Sonny inherited a lot of pieces that were ready to perform at a high level, but just needed to be put in that position to succeed. And to his credit, to Garrett Riley's credit, to Joe Gillespie's credit, they did that more often than not. Now the challenge becomes, how do you maintain it? How sustainable is this? He signs a top 20 recruiting class for the first time in TCU history. They've done a great job in the transfer portal, but they've also taken some big swings and misses. They're down to 2 scholarship quarterbacks on the roster. They're replacing an offensive coordinator. We'll get to that. And they're having a ton of talent that left for the NFL draft. What does Sonny have to do to keep this momentum that feels like it's kind of crusted and is fallen at this point? And how sustainable is it for TCU to continue to be a player at this level as Texas A&M, Texas Tech, and Baylor and the other schools that you mentioned are playing catch up and now more motivated than ever to get there?
Yeah, I think Baylor this year is the cautionary tale. They lose a Terrell Bernard, a Jalen Petrie, and Abram Smith, and they're not the same football team. It's hard to lose that amount of production and be the same football team. It's impossible to think you're going to lose Max Duggan, Kendre Miller, Quentin Johnston, your best offensive lineman, your best defensive lineman, your linebacker, the Thorpe Award winner. You're not going to lose those people and just be as good as you were the last year. The drop off, you're not Alabama, you're not Georgia either, right? Like those two teams live in a different stratosphere, maybe Ohio State as well. The rest of us live in this other world where you're going to take a step back. And we saw Baylor go from a 12-win team that won the Big 12 and the Sugar Bowl to a 6-win team. I think that would be the floor for TCU to go back to being about a 500 team, battling for bowl eligibility. The reason I think Sonny avoids that in a different way than Dave Aranda did this year is he's better in the portal. Baylor didn't do a lot of just instant gratification, go get some guys in the portal to fix that stuff. Sonny's been a portal guy since Nick Foles at Arizona. He's been doing this transfer thing before transferring was cool. He knows what he's doing there. Tommy Brockemeyer is going to be an instant starter and upgrade at tackle. JoJo Earls is incredible when he's healthy. Like guys like that are going to come in and help right away. Are they going to be 12-0 to start the year and competing for a college football playoff spot? Probably not. But we can't get to a point in 1 year where TCU goes from 5-7 to expecting them to be in the national championship hunt every single year. If next year they can win 8 games and keep the momentum off the field in recruiting, I think that's a great year. And it's something that jumpstarts you right into a playoff expansion where you don't have to be the 3rd best team in the nation. You just got to go win the Big 12.
How safe do you think that Sonny Dykes feels going into spring ball with, it looks like at this point, only Chandler Morris and Josh Hoover as scholarship quarterbacks on the roster? They've tried to get some of the big name portal guys, and it just doesn't look like any of those are going to fall this way. Is that a recipe for success outside of the depth issue, or does he need to go find somebody maybe after spring and depth charts at other schools start to settle?
Yeah, I think the second part's an important part. There'll be a secondary wave of quarterbacks available after spring practice happens and everybody sees where they land in the depth charts and know who's going to start. So he'll get another bite at the apple there. I'd be super surprised if they don't add another name that has some experience that can come in and push Chandler. But it's hard when you're trying to get a portal guy to come to a school where you got a returning starter, basically, right? Like Max Duggan started all the games, but this coaching staff already proved that it believes in Chandler Morris and what he can do in this offense. He got the starting gig in front of the guy who finished second in the Heisman. And so it's hard to go to somebody and go, hey, you got a realistic shot of coming in here and starting. And in this day and age, that information's out there. These kids are smart. They know what they're signing up for. And so I think they're going to have to go find somebody who's maybe a freshman, sophomore, junior, who's more suited to be a reserve guy. I don't think they go get a top line starter who really battles with Morris, because there's 130 schools out there. You only have a couple years to play. Quarterback, you got to go find your spot.
Well, and it seems too that how much of this is true versus how much is conjecture is hard to say, but it seems, they've had three kind of big name, two transfers and a potential incoming freshman on campus during this bowl prep season. And a lot of the noise coming out was they watched Chandler throw and decided they needed to go somewhere else. Like, can Chandler Morris be a guy, if he can't meet what Max Duggan accomplished this year, because that's an impossible expectation, is he a guy that can have TCU in the mix to play in the Big 12 championship next fall?
Oh, 100%. I don't think TCU takes a step back because of their quarterback play. I think it'll be fine. I think it'll be adequate to win 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 games. I'm just not sure the talent. He's not going to have a Quentin Johnston. He's not going to have an offensive line that has that many years. He's not going to have Kendre Miller to hand the ball to. The least of my concerns with TCU, honestly, going into the offseason is Chandler Morris, because guys like Garrett Riley and Sonny Dykes, who know a lot about quarterback play, already chose him one time to be their leader of their team. Remember, last year in the summer, we all expected them to go get another dude in the portal to go start in front of Max and Chandler. We weren't convinced that either one of those guys was the guy. He didn't do that, and it turns out because he thought Chandler could be a guy who could lead this program to heights. And so I think they're fine at quarterback. They just got to worry about the depth, because you can't go into the season with two guys.
I think another, obviously you can look at the highest of highs, TCU on the field celebrating after the Fiesta Bowl, the purple confetti falling all around, some photographers bawling their eyes out with pure joy. I mean, there was a lot of real positivity that came after that game. And then a week later, not negativity, but when you lose a game and you're the only game in town, the way that TCU lost it, can that have a hangover? Is that going to impact recruiting? Is that going to impact, kind of TCU's goals going forward? Or do you think that the rest of the base is so happy just to see them get there that they'll be able to kind of overcome the way that they lost and move forward on the goodwill that was built prior to that?
Yeah, I don't think it hurts recruiting, because the kids TCU's recruiting aren't choosing between Georgia and TCU, right? Like, they're choosing between TCU, Texas Tech, Baylor, Oklahoma State, and TCU could be like, yeah, we got blown out, but they're not even close to that, right? So like, I don't think they have any egg on their face on the recruiting trail. Perception wise with the fan base, yeah, it's going to sting. Like, it's not fun to get blown out on the national stage. You're going to be the butt of some jokes on social media. But at the end of the day, you were picked 7th to be in the Big 12, and you're playing on January 9th in Los Angeles, and your program received $2 billion of free marketing and advertising. Like, this is going to allow TCU to take a step forward in almost every single category. They're going to be able to add staffers. They're going to be adding money to the assistant pool. I'm sure Sonny got a nice raise, right? Like, the facilities, the NIL money is going to be flowing in, right? Like, this was a net positive in every form and fashion for TCU. The last thing stinks, but it does not undo, 13-2 and a great season, and one that we have to remember. He's replacing a dude that was there for 22 years. Like, ask Texas how hard it is to transition. Like, it's not easy to just transition from one guy to the next like that. They're rolling in the right direction, and they're further ahead than any of us could have ever dreamt.
I heard Spencer Hall talking on a podcast a couple of weeks ago about how, for Sonny Dykes, it's not about, like, he's not in the game to win national championships. They're going to say we want to win a national championship, but really what he's trying to do is be the best of his tier and have TCU competing for Big 12 championships. And if they occasionally kind of get in that playoff and they win a game or two, that's kind of just icing on the cake. Do you think that that's a fair assessment of where TCU is a program nationally right now? Or do you think that they legitimately believe that they can catch up to the Georgias, the Alabamas, the Ohio States, and hold the ultimate prize, even as playoff expansion looms?
Yeah, I mean, I know what Spencer is saying, but I don't wholly agree with it, right? Like, there's no way in Sonny Dykes' heart he doesn't think that they're capable of going and winning national championships. He was right there. He was in the game. Like, that 65-7 doesn't happen in a vacuum. That's not the result that happens every single time TCU and Georgia play. Like, they're not as far away as everybody thinks that they are, especially with the playoff expansion happening. You just got to get hot. A couple injuries happen. Like, we're going to see some teams win national titles that are worse than TCU was this year, right? In terms of talent, disposition wise. So I think that they have the aspirations to go compete with those schools. I think the hope is that the expansion of the playoff evens the talent level out. If you're a 5-star player, you no longer have to go to Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State, or Clemson to compete for the biggest prize. You can stay at home, win your conference, and go compete for that bigger prize. The transfer portal also evens things out in a huge way. Tommy Brockemeyer, JoJo Earl, like those guys are like 5-star top 10 in the state dudes that are now at TCU. And so I don't think the blue chip ratio is going to be as slanted as it used to be. And TCU is going to be in that next tier of teams that absolutely can punch up and go win some national titles in a new look world.
It's an interesting way to look at it, because my philosophy has kind of been over the last couple of weeks that, in a 4-team playoff, TCU has to win once and they're playing for a title. In a 12-team playoff, now you've got to be able to replicate that across weeks and weeks and weeks in that kind of new vacuum. But I didn't think about kind of how injuries and some of those things could certainly even the playing field. Obviously, I agree with you on the blue chip distribution, is that these guys are going to get to a school for a year or two and then think, I'm not playing here, or they're, and go find a place where they can at least get to the playoff easier. It's going to be interesting to see how that kind of plays out once the new playoff is instituted. In that vein, what does TCU have to do next year to establish themselves as one of the powerhouse programs in this new look Big 12 that we'll be seeing potentially as early as 2024, although the powers that be are still saying 2025?
Yeah, I think you need to be in contention in November. I think that's got to be the goal every single year if you're TCU. Sonny Dykes talked about how he never wanted to be the team picked 7th in the Big 12 again. He wants to change TCU's perception. He wants to be one of the helmets where no matter what you think of the roster going into the year, you just pick them to be 15th in the nation and 3rd in the Big 12 because you just respect what TCU is. That's what he wants to be. And so, I think for TCU, you just have to avoid the major step back like Baylor had this year. Go win 8, 9, 10 games, be in the hunt, maybe play in the championship game, maybe not, but just be in that conversation late in the year. And I think you've done a good thing, because you're 13-2 this year. Let's say you go 8-4 in the regular season next year. All of a sudden you're 21-6 in your first, 27 game. I mean, that's great. And so, I think expectations kind of dictate how we view results. And I think it's going to be important for everybody that follows TCU to kind of recalibrate results and expectations back towards, 8, 9, 10 wins.
Which school do you think in the state is closest to being able to pop off a season like TCU did? I mean, you mentioned, a lot of people around Texas Tech and Baylor think that they're close. I think Houston probably always feels that they can be close, that they can just kind of get it right. But which school, in your opinion, do you think could most surprise people next year and pull off that type of run?
If we're not talking Texas or Texas A&M, who, maybe they're more predicted to do that kind of stuff because they have the talent. I do think Texas is going to have a pretty good year. They return a quarterback that now has some experience, all of their offensive line, a bevy of wide receiver weapons, a really good defense. But I think if we're talking sleeper team who can just rise up and go win something, it's Texas Tech if we're staying in the state, because, they have better quarterback play than Baylor. Clayton Tune's gone from Houston, so they're going to have Donovan Smith, the old Texas Tech quarterback there in Houston. So, I think quarterback play is the fastest way you make that run. Max Duggan proved that this year. If you have a guy that can pull you along, you got a shot. Barron Morton, Tyler Shuck, those are two guys who have won games in the Big 12 that can do that. I'm a big believer in Joey McGuire. Again, I'm a high school guy. I work at Dave Campbell's. We've known Joey forever, so it's hard to not like him. But I think Texas Tech, who won 8 games this year and had its best year in the Big 12 since 2009. That was as good as Texas Tech's finished in the Big 12 since Mike Leach was their coach. That was year 1. I think if Sonny hadn't led his team to a 12-0 start, we'd be talking more about how much Joey's kind of changed Texas Tech. They could be a sleeper team for the Big 12 next year.
All right. We've kind of danced around this, but I think I want to address it. We still don't have anything official. We could very well know by the time this podcast posts on Thursday, but obviously there is a ton of smoke around Kendall Briles, son of Art Briles, former Baylor offensive coordinator, currently at Arkansas with some stops along the way, being hired as the next offensive coordinator at TCU. You wrote a great article about it a couple of days ago over the weekend on just what that means for TCU and all of the things that come along with that. You're someone that has as good a pulse on both the high school and college footballings around the state. Let's start with the first thing, like the nuts and bolts of this. What is the perception of Kendall in the state of Texas, mainly among, I guess, high school coaches? Because most of these players were too young to really know what was going on when everything was happening at Baylor.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you ask the coaches around the state of Texas, they still respect the Briles names. I think a lot of people may not like to hear that or don't want to hear that or wish it was different, but they do. Like Joe Gillespie is 20-year staff. When I'm talking to him at the Fiesta Bowl to do a story, the first person he mentions in terms of a mentor and stuff like that is Art Briles, right? So like he's still a name around the state. Kendall's somebody who's well respected in the coaching profession, I believe. He's been at multiple places since then and hasn't run into any problems. He, to my knowledge, hasn't been, kept out of any circles or not allowed to recruit anywhere or anything like that. And so I think in the coaching profession, he's not viewed as any type of, black sheep or anything that way. I think it's more obviously the fan bases and the perception of that last name more so than the coaches.
Do you think that, Art has a long history as a high school coach too, and some people loved him and some people hated him, but is it just that how tight knit that Texas high school football kind of circle is, that they really do kind of look out for each other, even if they don't necessarily like each other?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, 100%. It's the honor amongst thieves type thing, right? Like, I mean, they all have been in positions where maybe they're being blamed for, you know what I mean? I think they can put themselves in those shoes and explain it away in a different way than maybe any of us on the outside can. And so I think they see that as transgressions of those players and not necessarily of like Kendall or any of the coaches on that staff. And that, he's not in jail, so he's allowed to have a job, and he's had jobs at other places. And if he wants to come recruit our kids, he can come recruit our kids. I mean, that's what I think is thought about it in the coaching profession.
From an outside perspective of outside of the high schools, the coaches, et cetera, and how divisive it's been, obviously, among the TCU fan base, would this be, it's the thing we've been kind of throwing around with some of my friends is the juice worth the squeeze? Because, it's Kendall Briles, because it's a former Baylor staffer, and because it's TCU, is this going to be seen as a negative from enough people to hold up the announcement, which kind of is what feels like is happening now?
I feel like it's so. I mean, when the Fort Worth newspaper is writing a column about it, right? When Dave Campbell's is writing a column about it, when you have, people who cover the team daily talking about it, and you have fans interact, it just feels like a headache not worth it, right? Like, I'm not saying Kendall Briles isn't a good coach. I'm not saying he's, in a vacuum, I understand the hire. He's an air raid guy. He's coached quarterbacks. He's called plays. He knows the Dykes family, like all of that stuff. But you're not at some random university. You're at TCU. He's the biggest heel of my lifetime if you're a TCU fan, right? Like Art Briles is like, the no-go list. And so it just feels wild that after a 13-2 season, when you've built all this goodwill and it feels like you could be the mayor of the town and everybody's on board and swimming in the right direction and all the things that coaches want and all the things they always talk about, they always act like they don't want distractions, and that distractions are the worst things possible. And you don't want to add anything extra to something that's going good. But then you look at this decision, and how else can you view it other than a distraction? Even if it flies over, even if it's just noise from the outside, it's still a bunch of noise from the outside that you don't need after you've just gotten second place in the national championship game and you're trying to rebuild a whole roster and do it again. And so to me, the number one question I've been asked is kind of why? Why take that chance? Why have this bad publicity? Why deal with all of these conversations? And I personally don't have a good answer for it. Kendall's not, he's not the guy, he's not running the first best offense in the nation every single year, right? Like, it's not, like you said, I think that's a good way to put it. The juice is not worth the squeeze here. There's other guys that you can go get to run top 25 offenses that have put up just as big a numbers as Kendall's offenses had, that don't carry the baggage inside of the building that he carries.
And the last question on this topic before we can thankfully move off of it, but is how much of this is Sonnys' relationship with the Briles family? How much is he being blinded by the fact that this is a group of people that he goes way back with, that he's very loyal to, not just from he trusts their football judgment, but this is probably some of his closest friends and confidants, are from his coaching tree, and him and Art Briles have spent a lot of time together coaching.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a personal thing with him. I mean, those are his friends. I feel like he probably knows as much about the story as anybody, and he feels comfortable with the facts as he knows them to bring him on his staff. Now, that's not the only part of the equation. what Sonny feels about Kendall Briles is not all that matters. He is not the king and the addresser, right? Like there's an AD, there's a school president, there's a fan base, there's your players. There's all of these things you have to take into account. And so far, Sonny Dykes has batted 1,000 since he's been at TCU. And this could be kind of the first big mishap. And that last name matters, right? Like if this guy was named Kendall Smith, we're probably not having as
Kaz Kazadi or Carlton Buckles.
Right. It's more of a eyebrow raiser and kind of like that's not my favorite thing. But like, I get it. These guys aren't in prison. They're allowed to have jobs again. Maybe we, but when it's the last name and when you're the offensive coordinator and, all of those kind of things, it just feels extra and it feels unnecessary. And I feel like we all know that this would have been announced without already the little bit of backlash that it's already had. And so watching it over the next few days is going to be interesting because the longer it goes without being announced, it leads me to believe that there's second guessing going on behind the scenes and they're starting to try to find maybe an option B.
All right, let's get back to the fun stuff and the stuff that we know for sure is happening. TCU is going to kick off spring ball before we know it. That's a thing that happens closer and closer, especially the later and later that you play. What are a couple things that you're going to be watching from this TCU program throughout the spring and as they get ready for kind of the maintenance year now after such an incredible first run?
Yeah, for me, it's the running game. As we talked about earlier, I think the passing game is going to be fine. I think young wide receivers plus some transfers, Chandler Morris, I think that's going to be fine. What does that offensive line look like? What does the running game look like? Because there was a lot of times where it was Kendre Miller or nobody, and DeMarcado got in there and had a couple good games. But beyond that, what is there? And so they're going to need to find a new workhorse. The reason Max was so good, the reason that offense was so good is because it was balanced. They have to figure out a way to keep that balance without Garrett Riley, without Kendre Miller, without DeMarcado, without a great interior offensive line, or at least they're going to have to figure out a way to become a great offensive line again. And then defensively, for me, it's the secondary. They were excellent this year on that back five, right? And that 3-3-5 defense puts a lot of pressure on the safeties, on the corners, on everybody working together. Who replaces the nickel? Who's the number one corner guy? What do they do at safety? And then it's also just how do you handle different expectations? Last year, you could just play the us against the world. Nobody believes in us. Look what everybody's saying. Dave Campbell's picked us 6-6. All right. And this year, none of that's going to be true. You're going to be ranked in the top 25. You're going to be picked in the top 2 or 3 or 4 in the conference. People are going to think you're going to win 8, 9, 10 games. How do you respond to that with a whole new roster? That's going to be a big challenge for Sonny Dykes and everybody on the team.
Gary used to always say it's a lot easier to prove him wrong than it is to prove him right. So That's absolutely the challenge ahead for TCU. Mike, you were great as always. Always love talking to you. One of the best in the business, period, and getting to cover Texas in a way that you get to. Tell people where they can find your work.
Twitter, I am at Craven Mike, like a James Bond villain. And then TexasFootball.com. We're not just a magazine. I feel like we're always fighting that perception where it's like, yeah, y'all work one time a year. We have stories up all the time, every single day, cover all 47 teams that play football in the state of Texas at the college level, soon to be 48, 13 FBS teams. So plenty of content all the time. Check us out at TexasFootball.com.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you.